Here's something that will shake up Britain's art world forever. After more than a century of rigid collecting rules, one of London's most prestigious institutions just made a decision that could redefine how we experience classical art. The National Gallery has just announced the end of an era by abolishing its long-standing prohibition against acquiring paintings created after 1900. And they're backing this revolutionary move with a staggering £375 million investment that represents the largest cultural project Britain has seen in decades. But here's where it gets controversial. This decision is already causing ripples of tension between major art institutions, and some critics are questioning whether this bold move might actually harm the very ecosystem it's trying to improve. The massive financial commitment comes through an unprecedented partnership involving two substantial donations of £150 million each. The first arrives courtesy of Michael Moritz's Crankstart Foundation, while the second stems from the generous Hans and Julia Rousing Trust. The final £75 million will be sourced through the National Gallery Trust, alongside a consortium of anonymous benefactors who prefer to remain behind the scenes. This extraordinary funding will fuel Project Domani, the Italian word meaning tomorrow, which will see an entirely new wing constructed behind the existing Sainsbury building. The ambitious architectural undertaking officially launches its design competition this Wednesday, with the selected architects tasked with creating a space that should welcome its first visitors sometime during the early 2030s. To put this achievement into perspective, this represents the most significant expansion project undertaken by any major British cultural institution since the groundbreaking opening of Tate Modern a quarter-century ago. At a time when arts organizations across the country are desperately struggling to secure funding for capital improvements, the National Gallery has managed to pull off what many considered impossible. Gabriele Finaldi, who serves as the gallery's director, emphasized in recent BBC interviews that this new addition won't fundamentally alter what makes the National Gallery special. He passionately defended the institution's intimate character, explaining that its appeal lies in being human-sized and easily visited within a single day, a refreshing contrast to the overwhelming scale of international giants like Paris's Louvre or Madrid's Prado Museum. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has publicly celebrated this development as fantastic news for both the National Gallery and Britain's cultural sector as a whole. He highlighted how this investment will stimulate economic growth, create invaluable educational opportunities for young people, and ensure that exceptional art remains accessible for countless future generations. And this is the part most people miss. The truly explosive element of this announcement isn't just about money or buildings. The decision to begin collecting 20th-century artwork represents a fundamental shift that breaks decades of institutional tradition and diplomatic agreements. Historically, the National Gallery has maintained a gentleman's agreement with Tate, where each institution stayed within clearly defined collecting boundaries. Tate focused exclusively on modern and contemporary works, while the National Gallery concentrated on pieces created before 1900. This arrangement was designed to prevent overlap and competition between these major institutions. When Finaldi assumed his directorial role in 2016, he openly expressed frustration with what he considered an arbitrary cutoff date. He argued that it felt somewhat restrictive to reach 1900 and then simply stop, emphasizing that such artificial boundaries made little artistic or historical sense. Finaldi now justifies this policy transformation by pointing out that as 1900 becomes increasingly distant in our rearview mirror, it becomes natural for us to present a more comprehensive artistic narrative. This reasoning suggests that temporal distance creates the perspective necessary for proper historical evaluation. However, this agreement was never perfectly maintained anyway. The National Gallery already houses more than 40 works created after their supposed 1900 cutoff date, including significant pieces by revolutionary artists like Picasso and Cézanne. These existing acquisitions had already created cracks in the institutional wall that has now been completely demolished. The elimination of the 1900 barrier carries additional significance beyond simple chronological expansion. gallery leadership hopes this change will help address a glaring problem that has persisted for decades: the shocking gender imbalance within their collection. Currently, out of approximately 2,300 paintings in their permanent collection, only 27 were created by women artists, a statistic that reflects centuries of systemic exclusion in the art world. Nuria Balshaw, who directs Tate, has officially endorsed this announcement, stating that her institution plans to collaborate closely with the National Gallery to advance the national collection as a unified whole. Her diplomatic response suggests a commitment to cooperation, despite the obvious competitive implications. But here's what nobody's talking about openly. This shift creates direct competition for Tate at possibly the worst possible moment. The institution is currently grappling with declining visitor numbers and serious financial difficulties that have already forced painful staff reductions. Adding a well-funded competitor to their core market segment could intensify these existing pressures. This raises some uncomfortable questions that deserve honest discussion. Is this expansion truly about serving the public interest, or does it represent institutional empire building disguised as cultural progress? Will having two major London institutions competing for the same 20th century masterpieces drive up acquisition costs and ultimately harm both collections? And perhaps most importantly, in an era of limited cultural funding, should institutions be cooperating more rather than expanding their territorial claims? What do you think about this seismic shift in Britain's cultural landscape? Are you excited about the prospect of seeing more diverse, comprehensive collections under one roof? Or do you worry that this competition might fragment resources and duplicate efforts? Should cultural institutions maintain distinct identities and specializations? Or is it time to break down these artificial barriers entirely? Share your thoughts. This decision will shape how future generations experience art, and your perspective on whether this represents progress or problematic expansion could influence how similar decisions are made across the cultural sector.